Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. My name is Steven Bertoni. I'm the editor of our Forbes founders team, including Forbes Under 30. Today I have two incredible under 30 listers. That's what we call our members of our community. They are security experts, but also commerce experts and app experts. And we are going to get right into it. And we're going to talk about data security, financial security for customers and everyone else. So guys, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So let's have a seat. Let's get into it. I'll ask the first question, and then I want both of you guys to give a quick Twitter-length introduction, and then we'll get right into it. So, in terms of security and privacy, everyone here, who should we be more worried about? Should I be worried about hackers? Should I be worried about companies? Or should I be worried about governments, taking my information or abusing my information? We'll start with you, my man.
All right. Hi, everyone. Quick introduction. My name is Ben Brook. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Transcend, a data privacy infrastructure company. So in my mind, the sort of first thing to, I guess, worry about would be the company level. These are the sort of core infrastructure of data collection. So if you imagine all of the sensors that sort of exist, these are typically the things like your smartphone or your web browsing history, et cetera. And so the majority of the data collection that occurs is through some sort of corporate technology. So that's kind of the first place to start. Government is a huge concern, and hackers are a huge concern as well. But sort of at the bedrock is the corporate technology, and a lot of the privacy and security controls, I believe, have to start there for us to get any sort of protections from, for example, a government surveillance or from breach risk from a hacker. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Raunak Nirmal, CEO of Acquco. I think that obviously all three of these factors are pretty important. They play a pretty big role in privacy and security. I think the biggest threat, though, is hackers. And the reason why is because hackers don't have to play by any rules, right? The government still has a lot of oversight. People, residents, they all, criticize the government when something goes wrong. There's a lens and focus on what every government does. Similarly, for corporations, they're held accountable, whether by Congress in the US or by other companies, as well as social media, right? So I think everyone has to answer to their shareholders or people that live within their country, but hackers don't have that. They don't have to be held accountable because no one knows. They have anonymity. So they can go do whatever they want, whether it's a good actor or a bad actor type of scenario when they're doing the hacking, but they're never going to be held accountable. And that's what makes them the most dangerous, I think.
And just a quick background here. Ben runs a company that helps big apps like Robinhood stay in compliance and protect people's security. Raunak used to be a big shot at Amazon, and now he opens up his own company helping everyone create their own stores and sell things on Amazon and other things. So they have a really interesting background. What in your days and your research, what is the surprise everyone? Like, what's like the scariest kind of information? There's a fly in here. What's the scariest kind of information that corporations have about us? Like when you were digging into these things, like what was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe they know this about me or they know this about the average customer.
The thing is, it's crazy, and I think a lot of people know in today's age with TikTok how much information they truly have. The algorithms that these tools and softwares use and the data that they have access to, they're able to see everything about you. They know exactly what you like. They know you better than you know yourself. And I think a lot of people who are going through these video apps and different social media apps are able to get content delivered to them that they like without them knowing that they would have liked this before they see it. And that's what's really scary. But that's also incredible because it gives you the opportunity to see things that you would never go and be able to explore. So I think there's two sides of this issue where sometimes you feel like you want privacy and sometimes you believe that you deserve the most privacy and you don't want anyone to have your information. But oftentimes that unlocks a lot of opportunity and gives you access to data and information that you really need and want, but you would never otherwise have.
Yeah, so personally, I think probably the most surprising thing is less about the types of data that are collected, I think most of us know that it's virtually everything, like all of our behavioral data, where we go, what we do, the decisions we make, the types of content we engage with, our interests, etc., right down to like the most granular level, and historically for the past 10 years at least, right? So all of that is logged. It's searchable by many companies, and they have very rich profiles. What I think is probably more surprising is how easily accessible that is by, for example, a government authority. So, for example, in the United States, the NSA will basically have dragnets and the ability to sort of look through all of that data themselves for the purposes of national security. But there are obviously major concerns with that. Perhaps the NSA is not the worst example of what could be done with this data. But you could imagine, in the wrong hands, this is extremely powerful, and it can be a tool of oppression.
Yeah.
And so, I would say the more concerning part for me is just the degree of access that corporations and governments have into your whole sort of life story, and then of course, hacking becomes a serious concern once we get into that as well. So. Ultimately, there's all of our data is tracked, but it's more about like what are the implications of it.
Okay.
What's the next way that our elections could be meddled with because of this data, for example. There's a lot of concerns around the polarization, for example, in the United States, where a lot of these rich behavioral profiles are being used to actually further the rifts in American society, for example, and create more sort of ideologues within the United States, and sort of to some other nation's interest, sort of tear apart parts of the United States society. Yeah.
On the corporate level, is it like, does Google, they have like a file on Steve Bertoni, or am I like user like XXY1110, or both? Like, do they know who I am, or is it more of, yeah, I want to hear that.
So actually, yeah, this goes into another point where you actually have access as a corporation, and us, for example, have been contacted by companies that can give us access to things like our customer database, right? So we have a list of people that we want to work with and have some information about. And what they'll be able to do is, and we tell them, we're really interested when they search for certain things around the idea of selling their business, for example. And so as soon as that person goes on Google or in other search platforms and searches that term, sell my business, or anything related to that, we get triggered, and we know that they're tagged with this essential, behavioral model that they're going to be doing this and or are looking to do this, and that becomes the opportune time to go reach out to them and pitch them to sell their business to us. And that's just an example for our business. This is something that you could do for anything. So if you're selling wedding rings, you know exactly when people are thinking about proposing. And so you have that knowledge, and you're able to go and immediately start serving ads to them without them realizing, how did this happen? Everyone doesn't realize, how did that happen? It's because they know exactly what's going on, and it is to the personal level.
Is that through Google? Like, what services do you use for that?
So it's a private third party that has partnerships with a lot of different providers that work with data, so that they work with a lot of different sources of data. They're able to kind of put it together and create this user story.
So you're an entrepreneur, and obviously that's like you're both entrepreneurs, but you're trying to acquire customers. You're working on the B2B level, and obviously you want to do it's competitive, so you want to do what the state of the art is. How do you kind of work the fine line of using that information to like drive sales and revenue, but also be quote ethical and not creep people out, and also your job is to make sure that companies don't creep people out. So I want to hear that balance and how you guys it's interesting. It's like potential customers here. So this is two sides of the coin. So very interesting. Let's start with the consumer creep out part.
Yeah. So I think there is a fine balance to it. There's a lot of positive impact of these types of things like I talked about, but also the negative. There's a lot of protection put in place, right? So although there are these services that provide you this type of data, it's not like I know everything about you, right? So if, for example, I know that this is a customer on our list, and I know that this customer has searched for particular things related to trigger words that we have, but I don't know the name or details of that customer. We're just able to serve up the ads, and if they are getting these ads and then they engage with the ads and they want to move forward, then we kind of go forward in that way. So it's still protected, but you get a lot more insight than you would expect that you would be able to get.
Yeah, so kind of back to your earlier question, like does Google have like that specific data, or is it just a sort of general profile? They do have the specific data, and there are many companies who are either ad networks or data brokers, for example, who have that very specific data, and it's essentially like a dossier on your life. And the way they sell it to folks on their ad networks is typically through some anonymization. So they'll sell a general profile. So it's, for most ad networks, it's not widely available to get that as a customer of the ad network, but some actually you can. So there are actually many data brokers who will sell you those dossiers themselves.
Wow, okay.
And you can actually buy lists of like literally people in their home addresses who are, for example, police officers. Like there's a very scary implication of that, with very real stories behind consequences of that. Wow. So you get both sides there. But for me, in general, on the corporate side, I think the most important part is to actually make sure that consumers have choices here. And so right now there is a massive legal wave going around the globe, starting with GDPR, where consumers are getting what we call data rights. So this means consumers have the right to erase their data from any business, for example, the right to see what data that business has, the right to opt in or opt out of certain usages of that data. And that, for me, is like the crux of building any trust and actually continuing to have an economy that that uses data. You have to be able to actually build consumer trust, where these markets, like for consumers to continue to actually engage with these services, you have to at least build in these consumer choices where they do have some protections. They're not completely out of control to this effect. And right now, 2.7 billion people actually have received data rights. And this is a very fast-moving phenomenon. Billion. Yes. 2.7.
How do they do that?
Through global so through privacy laws. So
okay.
GDPR was kind of the first landmark law. LGPD in Brazil is the second, and it's basically a copycat of GDPR.
Gotcha.
California has it. China recently passed it. And now in the United States, individual states are also passing similar privacy laws.
Gotcha.
So Virginia, Colorado, and virtually every other state has a bill on the floor right now.
A quick question: are users individually opting in, or the government's opting them in automatically, like the GDPR?
Right. So that depends on the region and the privacy law. So in Europe, for example, the majority of data collection requires consent. So you actually have to ask permission of the individual to collect their data for that particular purpose. So that basically means most data is turned off by default. And for a consumer, if you want to engage with them, you actually have to get their permission to start collecting their data and using it for a certain purpose. In other countries, the United States, for example, even in California, where there is a very strong privacy law, it's opt-out. So we, by default, I'm a Californian, by default, my data can be sold between two different companies, for example. I have the legal right to tell them to stop that, though. And so I can actually turn it off, whereas, in New York, there's no such right. You can't even tell them to stop selling your data.
Gotcha.
So it will vary, but the one thing that is universal across all modern privacy laws is the right to erase data from any business and the right to export your data. So you can actually understand fully what all of the data they have on you is, as well as request that they delete that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I have a quick two-part question for the audience here. So show of hands, who here is on Instagram? Who here has ever had this experience where, like, you might be out with friends talking about something, and then the next day, that thing you're talking about, whether it's an event or something or a product, is being fed to you on Instagram. You didn't check it. It just, like, you're talking about this new brand of soda, and then suddenly it just pops up the next day. How are they doing that? Everyone thinks they're listening. Are they listening?
No.
Okay.
They're not.
So what's the magic trick? I want to hear the magic trick, because you get like,
Yeah.
I wake up and it's there. I didn't search for it. I didn't look for it. It's there.
Well, it's sad. First, their algorithm is that good, and second,
But it was in real life. It wasn't even on digital.
you're more predictable than you think. I'm sorry to say it.
No way.
That's true. Everybody, it's the most common thing I get. It's hey, like, I was talking about dog food with my wife yesterday, and then like next morning I get a dog food ad. Like, they must be listening, but it's actually not. It's like there are so many other data points throughout your life, where you're going, for example, whether you have a dog, whether you've ever Googled that, like, something related to a dog, and so. They may be able to look at that. They may be able to look at the last time you purchased dog food and actually say, okay, it's time for you to re-up on that dog food. And so that's maybe a simpler example, but this, like, the algorithms that they have are so sophisticated that they can predict things that are just like so abstract and make it look like you're listening, but that's actually just the truth.
Well,
Yeah.
so here's the
Yeah.
thing. So it was like end of COVID was weaning. I was out with buddies I haven't seen in like a year. We're drinking wine, talking about being stuck at home and traveling, and we're talking about airport security, and some guys are talking about Clear. In America, they like scan your eyes, you can cut the line. Like, and then the next day, we were all getting Clear ads. Like, it was like out of the blue. It wasn't like a repetitious dot. I mean, anyway, I think they're listening. What do you hear from your thing?
It really does feel like they're listening, but they're not. Even devices like, the Amazon Echo and different devices like Google Home, they have the capability of listening, and they might be listening for keywords to trigger, turning on the device and giving you function, but they're not allowed to, and they really can't go and use that data in that way. They would get, destroyed in the market. It's just not acceptable. And so, although it feels like that they're not, and just echoing what you said, right, there's a lot of tells before you actually think about doing a particular thing that you are on your path to doing so. So, like getting married or thinking about getting engaged to someone, you might be looking up, flower shops, you might be looking up different venues where you could go do these things. You might not have looked up, the actual ring, but you've done everything else up to that point. And so with machine learning, with a lot of this data, people can predict what you're going to do before you know it. And that goes into the earlier point on social media and the videos that you're being fed through apps like TikTok. They haven't heard anything about what you're doing either, but they know what you like. And similarly, that's kind of the reason why it feels like that.
Yeah, and just to work backwards from that example,
Yeah.
You were out the night before. Your friend had gone through Clear. Only he had gone through Clear himself.
No, we were just talking about in general. Like no one had traveled like a year because of COVID, and we were
Oh,
talking
okay.
about, I heard security lines are getting long these days, and they said, I'm thinking about doing Clear, and then like everyone got fed the ad the next day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so I mean, there may be two data points that we could work backward from. So he was thinking about Clear. There's a pretty good chance he may have Googled that,
Yeah.
or searched it in any other way. Maybe he himself got an ad. They also can easily detect that you were together that night, and so maybe it came up, and so maybe they decided to give those ads to you too.
So they're
as
not
a
listening,
follow-up.
but they know who you're physically near.
They know everything else, such that they don't need to even know your conversations. They can basically predict most of the gist of what you would have said that night.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
Cool. Jessica, can I put you on the spot real quick? So Jessica Scorpio runs a huge consumer car sharing business, big B2C. Yes. So if I'm at home Googling car rental or used car purchases, would get around to try to target me, or how, like those? But those key. What were the key ideas?
Search rent car San Francisco. I mean, if you search for car rental, or even, I'm sure we figured out things that people, when they're going to sell their car, there's so much testing that goes into this, but basically you look at, a lot of it comes down to price too.
Okay.
Because things that might have been cost effective 5 years ago or 5 months ago may not be now, so it's always changing.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, but it's very sophisticated.
Very cool. So I guess how do we best? I mean, not being paranoid, but besides these like opt-in laws, like for an average user here who's on their phones all the time, laptops, Alexas, cell phones, mobile smartphones, you name it. What's the give us a few like easy steps, because we're all lazy. Easy steps to like best protect ourselves, protect our families, our kids if we have them. Like what would you recommend? Both of you.
Want to start?
Yeah. I think one of them is really easy, and because of all the scrutiny that this type of a topic has gotten for a lot of the social media companies, they're kind of forced to do this. Apple, for example, whenever you download an app now, it asks you if you're going to allow the app to track what you're doing. And so very easily, they give the power to you immediately after downloading the app and opening it. You either allow or don't allow. And so if you want to get those targeted ads or feel like that experience of getting, content that's very relevant to you is important, then allow it to happen. But if you feel like you want to protect your privacy, don't want to have that information out there, then you can simply not allow it. And if you have an iPhone, for example, that'll cover most of the apps that you would be able to track you. And then at the same time, when you're going to social media, everything you post is out there and it's going to stay out there. So you just have to be careful about what you're posting. And that's in your hands.
Yeah.
Sorry? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information stored in cookies. I think with GDPR, you're giving, a lot of access or deciding whether you want to share or allow cookies to be stored and to share the information transferred through those. But again, I think there's a lot of different aspects on the mobile phone. There's a lot more control now. I think in the web browser, Google, for example, through Chrome, which has the most market penetration, tracks every single thing that you do. So it's less about how much is being tracked. It's more about who has the access to that information that you're allowing to see and what they're allowed to do with that information.
How about safe search? If you do safe search or private like incognito mode or private mode on Safari or Chrome, does that protect a lot of people if you want to do that most of the time?
That's a good question. I think
I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, more insight on that.
So it's I'll start maybe a little bit grim because that's not going to do very much.
All right, let's start grim.
Yeah. So, but I'll finish on a lighter note. So, for example, incognito mode, it doesn't do very much because there's fingerprinting technology where they can just look at things like the dimensions of your browser window and various other factors, your IP, various things. Basically, build a statistical probability that you're you, even though you're incognito. So it's not that difficult to re-identify through fingerprinting technology, but largely we are still in what I sort of view as the stone age of privacy. We are very, very, very early in the technology industry right now, where we've been building for decades the infrastructure to track people with just as much data as possible. That's been the mandate over the past 2 decades. Let's get all of the data and just scoop it up and figure out what to do with it later. And so there's just a lot of technology that you have to think about and opt out from. I would say as a sort of big starting point for your own personal protection, there's a couple things that I think are practical. So the first is start with the sensor box in your pocket. That's where the majority of your data is I guess created in the first place.
What is this? Let me see this.
It's a phone.
Your phone.
The
your phone. It's a box of sensors. It's collecting your location.
I thought it was like a box you put your phone in to protect you. Sorry. I'm showing my age here. Okay. Yes.
So.
A shield, like a shield of play.
Yeah. So that's where the majority of your personal data actually comes from. So whether the things you're tapping on, where you're going, your movement, your fitness, your health, all of that is basically starting from here and then uploading out into all the various services and being traded from there. So it's a good place to start. You can turn off a lot of switches. Apple, as the platform, has realized that they actually have a very important role to play here, where they need to basically put all the switches on to turn off all the sensors in your phone. So you can elect to turn off certain things for certain apps, and you should. Furthermore, I would also take advantage of all of the new privacy controls that are going into all of the services that we use every day. So one of the nice things about global privacy laws, even if you're not in a protected region, is a lot of the large services are rolling out their privacy controls to all users globally. And so on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, you can actually opt out of a lot of this personalization that is occurring that puts you into your echo chamber, that targets your ads, that really enriches your profile. And that is a really important way of starting to break free from some of that. So I highly recommend opting out of things like personalization in some of these platforms. if that's what you seek to do.
Gotcha.
But I would also start with the source of most of your data, which is your phone.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you mentioned, this fingerprinting stuff I've never heard of before. And it's kind of like a word arms race where you have literally trillion-dollar companies trying to optimize. They're hiring the smartest engineers, paying them like crazy.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you have almost like, you have like the government, or you have like small firms trying to protect data. And it's almost like the SEC versus like the hedge funds. Like you have like billion-dollar hedge funds and government, bureaucrats, like who's going to win. So like in the future, as things get tougher, like as things get more sophisticated and privacy is being run by these trillion-dollar companies, like is there hope, or are we going to all just get like run over? That's grim, I'm sorry.
You want to start that?
Sure. I think there's hope, right? Because at the end of the day, these billion-dollar companies, they have to respond to their shareholders, right? They're held accountable by their shareholders. And at the end of the day, if they're not responsible, they can essentially get canceled, right? That's today's culture. You get canceled when you're not doing what's acceptable. And so if that's the case, canceling for a billion-dollar company means losing billions of dollars in market cap. And that's devastating. And so, we've seen the impact of that. And so because that responsibility lies on them, they're held accountable by their shareholders, I think we have a lot of opportunity to, address these issues and not have to worry as much, hopefully, in the future.
Can I press on that?
Yeah.
So you have, Meta or Facebook, which at least in the States is one of the worst, like in terms of public perception. People don't like it right now. It's very grim, but their sales are up like crazy and they're making a ton of money. Google has a better perception, but they're definitely too big to fail at this point. Like I don't see anyone canceling Google. Like I can't even find my backyard without using Google Maps. So like, and they're so ingrained in people's lives. Like, are they almost too big to fail these days, and or they still have to respect what the public sentiment is?
I think it's too big to fail is a concept that does exist, but if you think about things like MySpace, for example, MySpace was huge back in the day, similar to Facebook.
Yeah, but Facebook was $1 trillion company.
It's not comparable in the same way, but I think the impact that you do see from being held accountable for doing the wrong things is pretty, large and impactful. So I think that despite their size, they are still held accountable. And you've seen changes, right? So Facebook gets a lot of scrutiny and has been getting scrutiny from Congress for a lot of the privacy, especially around the serving of ads, which is their primary revenue model, right? And so those changes have impacted the way that they do business. So currently, they're no longer using a lot of these data lists that they previously did, which had access to very personal information, allowing advertisers to target you based on very specific data that you would never want them to have. And so now that's no longer available. And the impact of that is Facebook no longer has as targeted ads. As an advertiser, as a person who's selling products, it impacts your ability to target the right people as well. And so, for a lot of sellers who sell on Shopify, for example, most of their revenue comes from ad-driven sales. And a lot of those guys used to use and still do Facebook ads. But the cost of those ads and the effectiveness of those ads has changed, right? The cost has gone up, the effectiveness has gone down because you don't have the same level of information. And so it does have an impact, and it has been impacting the way that they think about things.
Yeah, I would say these companies are generally too big to fail in the absence of regulation with teeth.
Okay.
So in the current sort of climate, if we push pause on global privacy laws, I think they're too big to fail. They'll continue to do their thing. But that's not what's happening. So what's actually happening is virtually every country in the world, every government is at least assessing a privacy law that offers data rights to their citizens. And that has actually started this sort of beating back of Facebook, Google, a lot of the major ad tech networks. And so even in GDPR, we're early days, right? This came into effect May 25th, 2018. And we're just starting to see the first enforcement action. So it's one thing to have a regulation, it's another one to enforce the regulation.
Gotcha, okay.
And so they're starting to actually really enforce this. And some of the first cases that were filed on that day are finally getting decisions, finally seeing penalties upwards of $1 billion at times. And the maximum consequence for violating GDPR is 4% of global revenue. And so you can imagine the teeth on a law like that,
wow, okay.
if properly enforced. That can actually really change, the sort of, I'd actually wonder if it's too big to fail with that, something that strong.
So right now it's like
Yeah.
we're seeing a backlog, and it's starting to come to fruition right now because it's obviously slow moving, but now we're starting to see the effects. We're starting to see the
Yeah.
teeth coming in.
Right, we're starting to see the teeth, and also it's going to be a while. Like, this is not going to happen overnight no matter what. So Facebook is going to reposition. They're going to say, is this okay? They're going to get fined. They're going to reposition, say, is this okay? They're going to get fined. It's going to happen for a
They're
decade.
going to A/B test the regulatory.
Oh yeah, and they have more lawyers than the regulators.
Yeah.
So like this is going to go through so many trials and so many but the laws are pretty crystal clear here, and so it will slowly recede, I think, and it will ultimately depend on how many countries follow suit with GDPR with Europe, and whether those countries actually enforce data rights for their citizens.
Okay,
So,
perfect.
yeah.
Well, one quick question, and then I think we gotta get out of time. Yep.
Yeah. So these
Can you
privacy.
repeat the question for everyone?
Oh, so if I heard correctly, you asked these privacy laws protect people in the United States, but what about people in Europe and in other countries? So there has to be a privacy law for the country, which protects its citizens. So the European Union actually has the GDPR, their privacy law, which regulates Facebook, an American company, and gives their citizens certain rights about their data. So Facebook actually has to fundamentally alter the way Facebook works for European citizens. They have to do the same thing for Brazilian citizens and for Chinese citizens, because these laws have actually completely changed what is legal in those jurisdictions. And so these regulators are actually bringing enforcement actions against Facebook in these regions, and for any sort of violation of their own citizens' data rights. So if Facebook infringes, yeah. Citizens outside of those regions are not protected. Yeah, and so each region is responsible for passing its own law. But once that law is in effect, that the courts in that jurisdiction can bring action against those companies for violating consumer data rights. And unfortunately now, the brunt of that, like, the brunt of the change was shouldered by Europe. So they were the ones who first said we're creating these data rights, and we're gonna actually. Yes. Oh yeah. They're the furthest ahead, in my opinion, ahead on privacy, and I largely think that we are in the very earliest innings of privacy law, and largely the pendulum is starting to shift back to a more balanced power dynamic between consumers and businesses as it relates to consumers' personal data. And so as we see more and more privacy laws passed throughout the globe, I think within even 5 years, we'll see upwards of 70% of the global population having data rights. We're already at about a third, and that's just in a matter of a few years. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys. We're out of time. I'm sure we can grab us for more questions. Thank you to our amazing panelists, and thank you everyone for listening. Appreciate it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.